Greetings all. Okay, so I have decided to get a little bit of low-hanging fruit here. This is some easy content for me that I don't have to spend very much time editing. That's change. But we are going to use the excuse of this new book that Bismarck over at Mercury Aviation History is putting out on the Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber. So, as I understand it, you are currently doing an Indiegogo campaign to support the launch and pre-orders of some sort of book about Stukas.
That's correct. So basically, Bernhard from Military History Visualized and myself are doing this. We started the campaign roughly a month and a half ago, hit our crowdfunding goal pretty early on. We've been blazing through the stretch goals. And we've been adding some more. And yeah, it's on the Stuka. We are essentially going to be doing a translation of a lot of German manuals and regulations on the aircraft. Experience reports are going to be in there as well. And those are then also going to be annotated and contextualized with a couple of small essays as well.
So is it so it's less of a technical history and more of a doctrinal operational history?
More doctrinal and more sort of showing the actual experience reports that the Stuka Geschwaders had in their original form and what they said and what they didn't say about their operations. It's not, as you said, it's not a technical history of the aircraft. There's plenty of books on that already. And it's also not a blow-by-blow sort of operational history where you go into the different theaters and see exactly what has happened in every corner of the world.
Okay, so I'm going to pepper you with a few questions, mainly focusing around the interaction with armor,
Sure.
simply because, hey, this is a tank channel primarily. But I guess we will start at the beginning, or actually even before the war, because of course Stukas were around, I believe, in the Spanish Civil War as well, were they not?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Small number of them.
All right, so the image that we tankers have, shall we say, of Stukas in early World War II is that they were used effectively as a type of mobile artillery, close air support, destroying French tanks, battering them, and they worked closely with the Paris as they swept across Poland and France. Is that actually correct? Is that what Stuka was designed for?
Not what it was designed for at all. In fact, there is a really interesting quote in one of the documents that we have in the book where it literally says, the Stuka is der Scharfschütze der Kampfflieger, which translated means he is the sniper of the bombers, which essentially already implies its use against pretty much the exact same targets. And if you go into sort of the ideas of what the Luftwaffe has with the Stuka, it's all pinpoint hard static targets, airfields, headquarters, communication hubs, bridges, stockpiles, even electrical installations and factories, and actually within factories, key specific buildings where they say, well, we can't hit them with sufficient accuracy with our normal bombers, so we're going to send Stuka dive bombers on these. And it's only beyond that where they say, well, theoretically, it could also be used against trains and ships, and maybe against armored columns as well, but only if we can hit them in bottlenecks. So bridges, towns where they can't escape, but not on the open field. And the reason why the Luftwaffe has this sort of conceptual idea of the Stuka is in a couple of their maneuvers, pre-war maneuvers, 1937, for example, they actually played this out a little bit. And they said that there is absolutely no chance that the Stuka has in destroying tanks in an open ground battlefield, because first of all, coming in at 4,000 or 5,000 meters, it can't see the tank, and if it can see the tank, then it doesn't even know if it's like a French tank or a German tank. So yeah, initially that's the popular image that we have is wrong when it comes to what the Stuka was designed for. But of course, throughout the war, and we'll talk about that, I'm sure, it is more and more shoehorned into this role, of course. Yeah.
So it was designed to say the approach was at 4 kilometers altitude, so 12,000 feet almost.
Pretty much, yeah. And it's interesting because if you look at the manuals, we have this popular image, right? Stuka comes in, dives down vertically 90 degrees, drops its bomb, pulls out, flies away. Well, if you start looking at the the manuals, you start noticing that, well, actually they're saying, 90 degrees not really required. 70 degrees seems to be the best trade-off, and don't always do the vertical dives. Sometimes you have to spiral down and then dive. Sometimes you have this is really interesting, and I haven't actually seen any sort of reports from pilots that have actually used this tactic, but they said what you do is you go down in sort of a staircase manner where you drop altitude progressively,
Steps.
and then you
Okay.
steps, and then you make your dive. So there's all these ideas of how to use the Stuka, and it doesn't really line up with that popular image. And I've had another discussion recently where this topic came up of propaganda footage, right, from World War II. What do we see what Stukas do when they attack? Well, they roll over into a dive, right? There's enough documents that state that rolling over into a dive is a very bad idea. Yeah, because essentially you're going to disorientate yourself, you're going to disorientate your gunner, and if you're in a formation, even if you space out a little bit, you're going just to be inviting disaster. What you're supposed to be doing, and also if you look at the dive recovery system that is built into the Stuka, that automatically deflects the trim tabs in order to give you that nose down tendency, the easiest thing of diving with a Stuka is literally just push the stick, right? That's what you're supposed to do. So all these popular images that we have in our head are, at least from the documents that we've seen and that we are really putting into the book, don't really seem to be lining up that much.
So if the Stuka is the sniper, shall we say, the campaign, so the list of targets that you're coming up with are almost more operational level than tactical front line. That's more or less it. So where does it fit in with the rest of the German bomber force? And if it wasn't the Stukas doing the frontline support in 1940, what was?
That's a good question, because the Germans, of course, make a distinction between the Schlachtflugzeug and the Sturzkampfflugzeug. Yeah, and the Schlachtflugzeug is, at the start of the war, a quote from a German document from 1939, a controversial type of aircraft. But this is the aircraft that is supposed to deliver close air support, right? Okay. The Germans going into Poland have 40 aircraft that can do this role. And that's the Henschel 123.
Okay.
With the Stuka, they're sitting on roughly 300, 350, depending on how we want to count operational numbers. And going into Poland, if you go through the records of the individual Sturzkampfgeschwader, the majority of what you're seeing is hard static pinpoint targets. Sometimes you're also seeing columns, but relatively rarely. Sometimes you also see artillery positions and fortifications, but mainly it is just hard static targets that are almost, you could make a parallel to nowadays with battlefield air interdiction and air interdiction, so the difference there, right? And the Germans make this distinction as well with the Gefechtsfeld, which is everything from sort of the front line over to 30 kilometers into your own territory or the enemy's territory. That's the Gefechtsfeld. And then you have the taktische Raum, the tactical area, which is up to 100 kilometers. And that is sort of between the Gefechtsfeld and the taktische Raum, that's sort of where the Stuka is supposed to operate. Of course, as the campaigns are launched in 1939 and then over into France as well, the Luftwaffe is requested by the army to engage more in close air support and deliver those airstrikes ever closer to the actual front lines. And that's where we're starting to see also the shift in mentality in the Germans, that maybe the Schlachtflugzeug is not this controversial type of aircraft, and that really they do need an aircraft that is able to deliver that close air support. And with the Stuka, they have it, but they only have it in sort of these very fixed type engagements where you can clearly identify a target and say, this is where you need to drop your bombs. Aerial reconnaissance is extremely important here. So getting pictures from the fortification that they're supposed to crack open, or from the roads that they're supposed to attack. And then, of course, also once that doesn't exist, or maybe they have aerial reconnaissance photos, but maybe the situation on the ground changes a lot, to have a direct link to the frontline troops, radio link that tells them where exactly the enemy positions are. But we're seeing, even as this is happening and as the Germans are putting together these Nahkampfverbände, so these close combat units, they are experimenting a lot. So they're using Stukas, they're also using Dornier 17s, they're also even using Heinkel 111s at one point, trying to deliver close air support, very quickly realizing that none of these weapons except the Stuka can do anything, and even the Stuka isn't that great of an asset there.
So when you say, so when the Germans put that major effort, the Air Force effort to support the crossing of the Meuse at Sedan, these would have been pre-planned targets, and they just said, look, you're hitting things on the other side of the river. And that was about the guideline that they were given.
Pretty much. I mean, how it turned out then in the individual flights, that's a little bit hard to say it specifically. But in fact, with a river crossing, that's exactly the sort of example we see in the Luftwaffe academies when they're teaching new officers that are going into the Stuka force of how to use the Stukas and how to use a close air support aircraft. Right? They say a Stuka, if you're crossing a river, right, a Stuka can hit the targets on the other side of the river exactly the minute before the assault launches in order to get that suppression. Once the assault has been launched, the Stuka can no longer act in the vicinity of this area. It has to act against sort of the
next
more
echelon.
Exactly. So the reserves being rushed in and so forth. A close air support aircraft operating at lower altitudes can still support the assault over the river and then also taking the riverbank and the extended ground behind it.
So in the earlier campaigns, when the Stukas were operating in the 30 to 100 kilometer range, were they, what proportion of flights, I guess, were given specific targets ahead of time versus, okay, you're just operating here, engage targets of opportunity, anything you think that's worth shooting at?
The further to the target away it was, the more planned it was, whereas they also had and specifically in Poland with the Nahkampfverbände, that was about half of the Stuka force was put into this Verband. That was pretty much being ready, alert readiness, where they said, okay, we will keep you in reserve until we know that there is a column approaching this area or that there are troops fleeing from this area and we want you to hit it. And that was very much based then on aerial reconnaissance and getting information from the army of knowing exactly where the German troops are, the Polish troops are, or of course the French troops later on as well, and then sending them out. What the exact proportion is, I couldn't say.
Okay, but there is a mix. Okay, did the aircraft require escorts, or was it just assumed that, okay, we got air superiority, you can fly around as you will?
In Poland, it was pretty much open. There were some Stuka losses, but it seemed also because the Polish Air Force with the fighters that it had weren't really able to pick that much of a fight with the Stukas, and the Stukas could protect themselves in a certain sense. In France, the Germans lost quite a few Stukas, and generally speaking, the Luftwaffe suffered quite heavily in the campaign in France. About a third of the force that goes into France stays in France, let's say. But especially later on, then with longer range missions, yes, it definitely needed escorts. It's not that it's a complete sitting duck. The Stuka did have a relatively good defensive capability in the fact that it was very maneuverable and it could turn very tight. And if you can do the Luftbury circles, or you can just outturn an adversary, and then as soon as he gets slow and low, fighters can pick it off, or they'll fly away. But yeah, generally speaking, you would require an escort.
Actually, going back, was the idea of having an army or land attack dive bomber relatively unique to Germany? Because I'm trying to think of other countries that may have had them. I don't think of the Americans. I don't think before Apache. Was that their first one?
That was pretty for the army. That was, well, they also had, I believe they tried a couple of SBDs as well. But yeah, I think for the army, that's a good question. Yes, I think that would be much the first one for the army. Although there is this, you can of course make this discussion of where exactly does dive bombing start, right? We always say it's with the United States, with the Navy in the interwar years. but sort of a close cooperation plane that acts in concert with the army. That goes back to World War I, with probably you could say the Junkers J1 being the first sort of real close air support aircraft that was able to do dive bombing for its time and cooperate directly with the army.
So why do you think that was then? What do you think the Germans decided they found a spot for a dive bomber in their regular air force and other countries less so?
Continental Army, as you said, so they needed to have a certain amount of flexibility and firepower, pinpoint firepower, when they're doing their very fast campaigns that were really planned to be executed within a matter of weeks. Right, the Germans didn't really want a long campaign. I think you could also go back to, of course, there's always this story about the Germans going over to the US, seeing the dive bombers for the first time, and then bringing back that idea and integrating it into their Luftwaffe force. I think part of the question really was, how can we get an aircraft that can deliver a relatively significant amount of firepower and ordnance at a target in a very accurate and flexible manner. And a bomber force for Germany was for a long time not viable. So heavy bombers, right? And I think the countries that went sort of the heavy bomber, even medium bomber route, tended to be the ones that didn't really investigate close air support and dive bombing and operational support of the army that much, whereas the Germans, who were more limited and who at best could mount a medium bomber force, tried to find a way to strengthen and just make it a little bit more potent. And I think that we're seeing that with the Stuka as being, like I said, sort of the sniper of the Kampfflieger, of the bomber force, of just augmenting the bomber force rather than necessarily augmenting the army Luftwaffe component.
So I was reading a report on close air support with the British Air Force, and would say one of the early war problems that they had was that the pilots had absolutely no interest in doing anything as unglamorous as dropping bombs. All they wanted to do was shoot down other airplanes. But when the Germans set up the Luftwaffe, they took army generals and they kicked them into the Luftwaffe command. So can I assume that there is a correlation there between the operations of the two forces?
I think so, definitely. I mean, in a way, there was always this fight inside the Luftwaffe of how much are we the army's backup or the army support group, and how much are we doing our own thing. But if you look at LDV 16, so Luftwaffendienstvorschrift 16, which is essentially lining out the operational air war as the Luftwaffe saw it, it's very much a concession of, yes, we're going to do our own thing in a way that one of our first priorities is going to be establishing air superiority and knocking out the enemy's air force. But beyond that, we are definitely also having to support the army, and the whole strategic element, although it is sort of written into their doctrine, gets left out by the wayside very quickly, because they say, well, anything that we are doing strategically speaking is going to have an impact that is way too late in the campaign. By that point in time, the campaign has already been decided. So it's very much doing it their own thing in establishing this air superiority where they can act in relative freedom, but then supporting the army as much as possible.
Gotcha. All right, so let's move on in France a little bit. They get to Dunkirk, and then you got two issues. One is you have the attempted reduction of the British pocket by, oh yeah, we don't need the Panzers, we'll just have Goering do it all. Was that a Stuka thing? Was that a level bomber thing, or did it just not care?
I mean, if you look at Dunkirk, and if you look at the days where the Stukas actually operated, which is only 2.5 days of the, what is it, 11 or 12? So, yeah, 12 days of operations. During those days, the British suffered quite heavily, and the evacuation force suffered quite heavily. Of course, also level bombers were used, but the problem with Dunkirk is that the Luftwaffe is given too many tasks. It is told to continue supporting the southern flank of the German army, where they're standing against the French. It is then told to increase their operational readiness and what's the English word now? Stock up back their force, because they've been suffering losses in preparation for Operation Paula, which is supposed to start in about 3 or 4 days after the operation of Dunkirk is finally completed, in order to completely knock out the French Air Force. And then it is supposed to hit the evacuation zone at Dunkirk. So it's got those 3 missions, and I would say at least if you have 3 of those don't work each other. You have to choose 2, right? You're either conserving your force and you're operating on one side, either at Dunkirk or on the southern side, or you hit both sides and then you don't conserve your force. And that is a major issue. And the other aspect for Dunkirk is the operational range of the Stuka. Yeah, with the B2 type, we have an operational range, depending on what bomb load you're carrying, of around about 400 to 500 kilometers. And the Stukas are, depending on which Geschwader we're looking at, between 150 to 200 kilometers away from the Dunkirk beaches. That's not a recipe for success. So they're flying missions when they can. Weather is a big issue. The Stuka is not all weather capable, so you need to have relatively clear skies in order to operate it. And all of that together, although on the days where the Stuka does operate, it does inflict major damages, means that for the most part of the operation, it plays absolutely no role.
So was it good at sinking ships or not? I mean, I hear two different stories on it. It was in Dunkirk.
It was, I mean, as good as a dive bomber would be. The pre-war, of course, you have this especially in the US and also in Japan. There was this idea of using level bombers against ships, right? The Japanese do it relatively well because of their training, whereas the US does it less so. The Stuka was as good as the SBD or even the VAL in sinking ships. However, what has to be said is that the Germans don't have any experience with this. And there's only one Gruppe, which, if I remember correctly, is Dritte Gruppe Sturzkampfgeschwader 1, which had any specific anti-shipping experience and training before the war started, because it comes from the Trägergruppe, which was supposed to be put on the Graf Zeppelin aircraft carrier, which the Germans, of course, never completed. So that unit is the only one, as far as I know, that had any consistent training done in sort of the Baltic Sea, the German part of the Baltic Sea, against old ships that from the Kriegsmarine that were left over from World War I. Apparently, we had some of those. Yeah, I was surprised as well when I read that. I'm not an expert on naval history, and I realized that. Yeah, exactly. We would need him on this. But the Dritte Gruppe Schlachtgeschwader 1 is sort of the only one that had any experience on it. And they, as well as the other ones, did relatively well. But speaking of the experience in anti-shipping, it is definitely something that the Germans then also invested more time into, and specifically also instructed their pilots that were going to the Mediterranean later on, starting sort of in 1941, in how to sink ships. And there is a dive bomber school in Graz in Austria, that was also set up that had like fields where ships' hulls were painted in. You were supposed to obviously drop your bombs there. But with the Stuka, the checkout requirement for pilots was that you had to put bombs consistently on target with a maximum deviation of 30 to 50 meters. A ship, you can miss a ship still with that deviation. So that gives you an idea of, yes, you can hit a ship, but it doesn't mean that just because you're accurate is that you're going to be sinking ships left, right, and center, right?
Gotcha. So where on the scale of priorities were Stuka pilots? Were they considered to be above average pilots? That, you know, oh, you're a really, really good pilot, we'll put you into a Stuka? Or was it kind of like, yeah, well, you don't have enough patience to be a long-range bomber, you don't have enough aggression to be a fighter pilot?
They were definitely some of the better trained pilots. And in the beginning of the war, the Luftwaffe considered the Kampfflieger, so the bomber pilots, and the Stuka-Flieger were sort of grouped into that as the more elite of their force. and as the more prestigious and also the more important pilots. The fighter pilots were sort of, we kind of need these guys in order to prevent us being shut down, but we are doing the actual work. And it's only very late in the war, sort of starting with 1944, that the fighter pilot is suddenly put on this pedestal, and then very quickly removed from that pedestal. Fighter pilot mutiny and all that stuff. Yeah. But nowadays, I think definitely, because we always talk about the aces, it is worthwhile remembering that for the longest time in Luftwaffe history, World War II German Luftwaffe history, the bomber pilot and the Stuka pilot was considered the more adept and the more well-trained and the more important pilot than the fighter pilot.
As a tanker, I fully agree with this assessment. All right, so let's hop over to the other side of the world then, to, well, other side of Europe, I guess, to the invasion of Russia. So the Stuka is still considered, by mid-41, still considered a perfectly viable frontline aircraft and has the same role?
It has the same role. There are certain improvements that have been made for Luftwaffe Army cooperation in order to allow the Stuka to operate closer to the front lines. Still very much in that static sort of moment of, well, we're running into tanks that have dug in over there. Let's have the Stukas drop a couple of bombs on them. And as they're doing that, we advance, right? So it's not very much more of a fluid thing that you could do with a more dedicated close air support aircraft. Whether it was still considered to be a viable tool. Now, that's an interesting question, because the Luftwaffe, by this point in time, and you see it in the internal discussions, and this comes again and again, 1941, 1942, 1943, they always say the Stuka is worthless in the West. Now, right now, they don't have any issues in the West, right? But they know that the days of this aircraft are numbered on that side of the front. In the East, it is still usable. However, they have this rather intense discussion between 1942 and 1943 as to whether the Stuka is still viable. Yeah, so usable, yes; viable, perhaps no. And this takes shape in many interesting sort of, if you go through the protocol of all these discussions, there's a couple of moments where we can talk maybe about some of the things that, for example, Milch, so General Luftzeugmeister, who's head of the Air Ministry, the Reichsluftfahrtsministerium, says about the Stuka and the Stuka pilots, and opinions are very diverse and very passionate. But as a tool, it is still viable, or rather usable, and no longer viable in the long run, because what the Luftwaffe has with the Stuka is something that works really well as long as the army is advancing. Because you need that sort of, you need the army to advance, and then the Stukas to hit the reserves that are coming in from the enemy, or to hit the fleeing troops that the army is driving away from them.
So if they were
static, sorry,
if they were not so valuable in the West, where did that rate them in North Africa then?
North Africa is interesting because in the Mediterranean front, as an anti-shipping tool, the Germans very much appreciate the Stuka. In North Africa itself, from what I can tell, they're not that happy with it. Much of this has to do with just sort of the tropical conditions, the sand, and that sort of stuff. But also in spotting tanks, apparently, or in spotting enemy movements is a lot more difficult. And the operational freedom that they have in the air in Africa is also less permissive than on the Eastern Front for a long time.
Was the Stuka considered easy to fly?
Yes.
Yeah. So back to Russia. So we're advancing across Russia. All of a sudden, the winter hits, and you said it's not an all-weather aircraft. But if it was really cold, but the sky was blue, how did the airplane work?
The biggest problems that Germans have in the first winter of 1941 to 1942 is simply getting the planes ready to take off, because first of all, they don't have any sort of equipment or installations in order to house most of these aircraft in a protected space. sometimes a single airfield has only one heating machine that blasts like hot air into the engine bay in order to actually allow the engine to be turned on. And they have to share this amongst multiple machines, which is not really something that works, right? They improvise a lot, so they build these contraptions where they can work on the Stuka and open up the engine cowlings and then heat up the engine. But it's very difficult, and in fact, most of the Luftwaffe's Stuka force is, for the majority of the winter of 1941 to 1942, more or less grounded, or flies a very limited amount of missions compared to what they used to do. And it's only sort of within the spring of 1942 that it's really starting to pick up again. And that's also then when the Germans are starting to realize that maybe with the Stuka, while it's still working now, in the future, they're going to have an issue with this machine because its role as being the supportive force for the Heer doesn't really work unless the Heer can actually be on the offensive.
Which I guess, what was Stuka's contribution to Kursk then? I guess one of the last major offensives.
Kursk, same as with Kharkov, actually, if we want to talk about Kharkov first, because I think Kharkov, the second battle of Kharkov, I believe there are 3 or 4, depending on how you count it. But in May 1942, this is sort of the moment where the Germans have, I call it almost the last hurrah for the Stuka. Because the Germans are rushing in a lot of the Sturzkampfgruppen that are in the east. So they have Sturzkampfgeschwader 77 and Sturzkampfgeschwader 1 being brought in. Together, they fly about 2,500 sorties in that month alone against the Soviets. And that's where we are seeing the Stuka being used almost as a firefighter. So trying to contain the Soviet advance and trying to hit the columns or the Soviet true concentrations that the army cannot hit or that the army cannot attack. But that is really, I would say, nearly unique. Compared with Kursk, it is probably once again put back into that role of sort of being a static, hit certain targets that have been pre-identified. Because of course the Germans are much more prepared, from what I've taken from sort of the literature, they're much more prepared for Kursk than they were for the Second Battle of Kharkov, which took them by surprise.
So you had said that as the aircraft is better suited for the offense, I guess that there's 2 follow-on questions. One is, as the Germans started to go more onto the defense, did they have to improve their close air support coordination? Like, for example, would they have what we would call JTACs today, special air trained forward observers that were right on the battlefield? And the second part of the question, I guess, is this also part of the reason that they put those 37 gun pods underneath, because you could fly low and identify your own targets and still engage them?
Yes. So yeah, they had FLIVOs, so who were sort of the person on the ground telling the Stukas exactly where to hit and calling in the Stuka support. And that's probably, you could say, a precursor sort of to what we nowadays with forward observers. With the gun pods are something that start appearing around about 1942 as an idea. And the qualities of the Stuka, or the Stuka itself, is actually not considered as the primary aircraft that the Germans want to use gun pods or anti-tank cannons on just yet. They're still thinking of using this plane potentially retrofitted with more armor and heavier firepower in a close air support role. So dropping the altitude of the aircraft and allowing it to act more dynamically with the ground units. They end up doing both, right? So with the D model, especially then we come from the D1 to the D3 to the D5. They obviously upgrade the firepower, the forward-facing firepower, from the 7.92 millimeters to the 20 millimeter cannons, and that is simply so it can be more viable against gun emplacements, soft targets, trucks, the like. Whereas the gun pods are obviously meant for tanks. Initially, they try everything, of course, the Germans. Yeah, they try the 88, they try 88s, they try Pak 40s, Pak 41s. They have the MK101 that comes out at this point as well, so it's a 30 millimeter cannon. And the planes that they have slotted for this are, the Ju-88, the Bf-110, the Henschel 129. And eventually somebody comes around and says, we could try it with the Stuka. They realize that the bigger or the higher caliber weapons are not viable. It's just not possible, whereas the MK101 is more or less reserved for the Henschel 123. So this idea comes around of using the flak cannon, anti-aircraft cannon, and that is mainly done because it's available. This is what they have. And you don't really have to talk with the army in order to acquire a couple of samples and try it out. You have your own flak guns. So the 3.7 centimeter guns are being put in place. And I think in December 1942, the first D1 model is refitted with them, and it starts then flying in January 1943, when the Germans are putting together this special Versuchskommando, trial command, in order to have frontline experience with anti-tank gun weapons mounted on aircraft. And it transpired that a lot of the ideas they had with mounting 88s on Ju-88s was a bad idea. That the Henschel 129 is doing relatively well already in fall of 1942 with the MK101, and they want to continue that. But for now, they seem to have this potential stopgap with the Stuka and the Flak 18 or the BK 3.7, as it didn't become known. Although it is meant to be a stopgap, I don't think you could say that it really was, because as the Henschel 129 is being fielded in increasing numbers with the MK101 and then the MK103, and the Ju-87 has those cannons, they're still operating in very small numbers, and the Germans are actually debating and having quite a lot of issues in trying to find the best way of using these anti-tank aircraft, because they're really only designed to do one thing. And if they're not attacking tanks, then it's an airframe that is just wasted, sitting on the airfield.
So the ammunition in these 37 is pure armor piercing. There's no mix of AP and HE.
Funnily enough, some of the first missions that the Ju-87s flew, they only fired HE. And they only fired HE against trucks, and they said, "Oh yeah, this works perfectly well. This is fantastic. The trucks explode, But eventually, of course, they were like, "Okay, we need AP." I think they only used standard AP initially, and said this looks relatively okay. We're seeing some success with this, and then of course later on they had a tungsten round, the Wolfram-Geschoss. That was added as well, and then theoretically speaking, you could believe it was 140 millimeters at 100 meters, 90 degrees flat angle. You could penetrate that. But the Germans, funnily enough, even though they say it's viable against the KV-1, which is actually the bigger worry for them, rather than the T-34 for a long time, why it's viable, it's not good enough. So again, stopgap. We will get something better. They never do. That's sort of how they were starting to use it.
So towards the end of the war, or the end of Stuka's career, were more flights being done with the cannons or with the bombs?
Bombs. There's only a small number of units that actually operate the cannons. And this goes back to what I mentioned earlier, is that the Germans are having issues with trying to understand or trying to really decide on how large do they want their anti-tank units in the Luftwaffe to be, how many airframes can they siphon off from the normal operations and just put into this pure role, because what they consider these tank hunters to be is a Sonderwaffe, a special weapon, which is only used if the Soviets are breaking through in force with their tanks, and then the army doesn't have anything in the area to stop them. So you come in with the Stukas, you come in with the Henschel 129s, and you try to stop that breakthrough from well, making things even worse.
So it sounds like the American tank destroyers then, except just airborne, or like an Apache helicopter battalion.
Pretty much. I mean, sometimes you hear this phrase firefighter, right? It's meant to go where something is happening. And yeah, I mean, the Germans, this is also, some people might wonder, like, why would they put an 88 on a Ju-88? Obviously, that's going to be a massive target. It's not going to be viable. Well, very early on, the Germans decide that whenever they do anti-tank duties, that they're only going to do this against the aforementioned broken through tanks. Yeah. They're not going to hit those on the front lines, because that's where the flak is. That's where a lot of firepower is going to be facing their way, and that's probably also where enemy fighters are going to linger. Whereas these formations that have broken through, they're a little bit more or less coordinated. They don't have AA defenses going with them. They might not have fighter escorts that are patrolling the area, and they're a lot easier to take out. And in that constellation, theoretically speaking, performance and maneuverability is all not that important. What you really need is just a gun that can destroy those tanks reliably.
I mean, an 88 does seem to be a bit excessive for the job, though, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah, it was. I mean,
even a 7.5 is good enough.
If you ever go to the German military archives, there's this beautiful file that I can point you to, where you see pictures from a J-88 that has fired a couple of 88 rounds. It's not looking good. I mean, it landed, but it's not looking good. You can just see the hull being sort of crushed a little bit. I think some of the propellers broke. The windows for the pilot shattered. I mean, it's not good.
Okay. So one of the problems that the Germans had, at least on the tank side, is that they didn't put any effort at all into sustainment. So they built 10 tanks, and then they might build one spare engine. Mm-hmm. Was that similar with the airplanes as well? Did you have airplanes just broken down awaiting parts?
Yes. Specifically with the Ju-87, actually, production was a bit of a nightmare. Production is done not by Junkers, but by Weser Flugzeugbau. Weser Flugzeugbau is situated, or was building their aircraft in Bremen, just to the northeast of Bremen, in Lemwerder. And in Tempelhof. So the famous Berlin airport with Okay. So Tempelhof was essentially a factory. Obviously, since it's the Luftwaffe, they used also a lot of slave labor and concentration camp victims for their production. That's what the Luftwaffe did on an industrial scale. And they never produced enough. Part of this was because Bremen was very easy to hit by the Allied bombers, and there was a lot of damage there. So everything was then moved over to Berlin, and then Berlin became an easier target because the capabilities of the Allied bomber force increased. So that wasn't going all that well either. And the Luftwaffe has extreme difficulties in increasing production for the Ju-87, as well as spare parts. So in 1942, we're still talking about just about at the end of 1942, we're reaching a production capacity of 100 aircraft a month. They want to get this up to 150 by mid-1943, and they sort of get there, and then 350 by 1944. Knowing already that by 1944, they're actually not going to be using that aircraft that much anymore. They're just putting it into production because they say, well, this is the only dive bomber we're going to have throughout this war, because whatever we're going to design is going to be too late to put into production by whatever the end of the war is going to be. They already say this in 1942, right?
But according to Hitler, the Me-262 is a great dive bomber.
According to Hitler, a lot of things. I don't know what to say about that.
So let's say you got a squadron on the Eastern Front in early 1944. Out of how many aircraft on hand versus authorized would actually be working?
The operational numbers of the Stukas at the end of the war were relatively good because there was an increase in what we also just mentioned, spare part production, but also because the Luftwaffe was then operating a rather small number of Ju-87s, which meant that they could cannibalize a lot of parts from other Ju-87s. The majority of the Geschwader, or actually the Nachtschlachtgruppen, they were called now, they were no longer Geschwader, were operating, as the name implies, Nachtschlachtgruppe at night. So those were the ones that are dropping bombs. That's what I mentioned earlier, why the majority of them were still using bombs at this point in time. And they're sending out, both in Italy, but especially on the Eastern Front, they're sending out between 2 to maybe 20 Ju-87s every night in order to bomb specific targets that are considered of importance to the Soviet army. And they're flying maybe 50, 60 kilometers into the Soviet territory and then dropping their bombs there, right? Again, this is against targets that are very obviously or easy to spot at night.
So would one airplane drop flares for the others, or how would it work?
Sometimes, yes. Usually the lead plane would drop flares, and the following ones would, the lead plane also being the one piloted by the most experienced pilot and navigator in order to find the target, and then the other ones would drop their bombs. They would do this from much lower altitude, so they wouldn't go into a 90-degree dive. They would go into a very short, shallow, sort of 40-degree dive, sometimes engine off, in order to not give your position away or your presence away. Exactly. And that would be the majority of the Stuka operations on the Eastern Front, even in 1945. Beyond that, of course, you have these Panzerjägerstaffeln. So I think you have in total 3 of them. You have one with Schlachtgruppe 9, one with 10, and one with 77, I believe. I might have to check that again. And these are units that have roughly between 10 to 12 aircraft. And they're keeping those in with a relatively high degree of operational readiness. So not every plane can fly on every given day, but it's not surprising to see something like 75% availability.
It's not bad at all. Okay, so middle of 1944, the Western Allies do something really unexpected, and they land in France. Do Stukas play much of a part in the Western Front, or do they just keep them on the Russians?
That's what I said earlier. They know that they can't use them on the Western
Front. They don't even try.
I think they tried a very short time, a couple of weeks, again with night bombing. But the most experience that Western armies have with Stukas dive bombing them at night is in Italy. And that's where, of course, also British Beaufighters inflicted quite a heavy toll on Stuka pilots, because obviously the Beaufighter at this point has been retrofitted into a night fighter with radar, and there's a little bit of a duel that is being played out at night between sort of the Allied landings in mainland Italy, 1943, and then 1944 until sort of the end of the war. I think that was Nachtschlachtgruppe 9 specifically that was stationed in Italy.
So was the Stuka considered to be a good tank buster, or that was just out of desperation?
Depends who you ask. I mean, I would say it's what they had and it's what they could use. You have certain pilots who did well in the fact that you have a lot of kill claims coming by them, like Rudel. I mean, we'll have to mention it at some point, I guess.
You brought him up. I wasn't going to.
I wasn't wanting to, but yeah, supposed to have like 500 kills with the Stuka. The funny part
if it's anything like the Americans, it's a 10-to-1 kill ratio, or 10-to-1 claim ratio.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you know how the Allies did their kill claims in Normandy on German tanks. So it's the same old story. What I find interesting and why I actually wanted to bring up Rudel is, again, Milch, and there's a discussion in the Luftwaffe, and Milch at some point gets really, really angry and says, well, if Rudel can knock out so many tanks, why cannot every other pilot, or maybe not every other pilot, but every second or every third other Stuka pilot do at least half of that? Which I think gives you sort of an impression of where the authenticity or the accuracy of rules stands in terms of what is actually doable by a pilot with the Stuka at this point in time.
Gotcha. Okay, I had another question off the top of my head. I was starting to run out of them here. That maybe I'll do a quick edit in the video just while my memory refreshes itself.
I mean, what I was wanting to add again about why I think Kharkov is so important, right? Again, going into some sort of the discussion at a high level in the Luftwaffe is that they're already starting to foresee the issue that the Soviet tank force might be in the future, right? Because I think it's on the 26th of May, Milch has this. Let me quickly go into my notes here because I have the direct quote. Obviously, he didn't speak English, so I translated this. Yeah, so on the 26th of May, 1942, he says, this is just at the trailing end of the Second Battle of Kharkov, sometimes 100 tanks break through. These must be eliminated quickly by a small number of around 5 aircraft, and each must destroy 20 tanks, 2 to 3 sorties. I mean, your reaction is exactly what I was looking for. Yeah. That's and yeah, that's
optimistic.
Sort of optimistic indeed. And remember, at this point, the Germans have the Henshu 129 that is just starting to be operational, and the MK101, which is their only envisioned tank busting cannon, which does relatively well, and it's only following this experience in Kharkov, which is why I think it's so important, that they're really starting to put a lot more emphasis in this. And in a year's time, they start to have these, within a year of this happening, they start to have this dedicated tank buster force, you could say, already operational, albeit very small. Now, you can argue, is a year's time too long? Is that too short? Is that actually quite good in terms of turning this around and starting to put field things into the operational units? I don't know.
I think it's reasonable. I think people always underestimate how long it takes to get a new idea into the field in serviceable numbers with a doctrine that people know what they're doing.
Yeah.
How close would a Stuka have to get to use its 37?
I mean, there's reports of them getting close to like 50 meters, flying very slow.
Yeah.
I would assume that given the propensity of pilots to open up earlier and a misunderstanding the actual distance they are from a target. You have this a lot with fighter pilots as well that think that they are point blank and they actually are starting to open up at 500 meters. I would sort of, from what I've seen, is sort of between 100 to 300 meters is when they're starting to opening up. With the Stuka, if you don't get shot at, which is very unlikely given that the Luftwaffe experience on the Eastern Front is that every single person with a gun will fire.
Yeah, okay. I will.
The officers firing with their pistols, the riflemen are firing with their rifles, the machine gunner takes his, there's this beautiful.
And there's no armor on this thing. We're not talking to Shumavik here. I mean, it's just thin aluminium.
Later on, there were armor plates added, specifically to the cooling system. That was the one thing that.
Not the pilot.
Well, the pilot did get some armor plating, but it's funny because you read through all these discussions and you're starting to see like, oh yeah, the Stuka is perfectly fine in taking hits as long as we armor the liquid cooling system, right? So yeah, I think the pilot at that point, I mean, he already had a backplate anyway. But yeah, he definitely needed something from below because the Stuka, once it comes out of his dive, is a very tempting target indeed. So yeah, I mean, but yeah, on the Eastern Front, everybody fired at them. Actually, there's a question that I wanted to ask you as well.
What's that?
When the Stuka starts being used as in this anti-tank role, right? This is an experience report that comes in from the Army, not from the Luftwaffe, in March 1943. They say they've just observed Luftwaffe planes coming in with those gun pods, shooting at a couple of tanks, and they find this absolutely useless. And the German army tells this to the Luftwaffe. And the reason why they find this useless is they say, well, fair enough, you claim to have knocked out a couple of tanks. You haven't, by the way, but you claim to have done so. But that's not what we want. We want you to suppress the enemy. Because if the tanks are advancing, usually what they have is infantry with them. And if the Stukas are coming in with gun pods, they can only act against the tanks. They will not be able to suppress the infantry. If they drop bombs, they can do both. So maybe sort of from your perspective as a tanker and as a,
that matches up with the experience that the Americans and British had, especially in North Africa, but there were a couple of other in Italy as well. They discovered that if you stripped the German forces of their infantry support, if you stripped their tanks of their infantry support, the tanks generally would stop the advance. For obvious reasons, because you couldn't really get into a close quarters fight with a pure armored unit, and that was, right. I mean, that was identified very early in the war. So early tank divisions, almost every country had this problem. Was they would have, let's say, 2 battalions of tanks and 1 battalion of infantry, and suddenly they realized, no, this doesn't work. You cannot have more tanks than you have infantry. I mean, the worst of it was, I think, a 1970s, 1980s U.S. Armored Division with 6 battalions of tanks to 4 battalions of infantry.
Right.
Was one of the heaviest tank-heavy organizations I think we've ever seen. So I can fully understand where the army are coming from. The other thing is, I guess, if you are shooting with it against tanks and you miss the tank, then you've achieved absolutely nothing. Exactly. At least a near miss with a bomb might wound somebody.
Yeah.
And you get at least one casualty out of the sortie instead of just wasting the people's fuel.
Yeah. Plus the ammunition, which is, I think at this point they were still firing generic AP, which had, if I remember correctly, sort of 60 millimeters of penetration at 100 meters, which against tanks at this point.
Well, but I mean, I'm assuming they're coming in from the side or the back, like an A10.
Yes, they are.
Yeah.
But even then, I mean, I think we had this discussion once before, a long time ago. What is a kill? Like, what can you rate as a tank kill, and what is sort of a mission kill, or is immobilizing? Is that a kill? Is injuring the crew and make them bail out and run away a kill? Is it blowing it up, having it burned out, having it being irrecoverable? What is a kill? And that, I think, also factors into all these claims that we have on the Eastern Front with these massive amount of tanks that were supposedly destroyed, or in Normandy with the Allied pilots. Whereas in reality, what you could maybe at most do is immobilize a tank or just damage it, maybe momentarily panic the crew, and that's about it.
I mean, well, from the... there's an argument that said, as long as they are no longer shooting at you, you don't care.
Yeah.
They could be alive, they could be not alive, but if you're not contributing to the fight and you're going to live as a result, that would be a success. Yeah. But as you say, I mean, that's a long-running debate that we've had before, and I have no doubt that we will have again in the future.
Definitely.
All right, so I think we're about coming to a close on the conversation. So you say this thing is going to go, this crowdfunder is going to go on until when?
The 3rd of October. And then there is this Indiegogo option for having it in demand. So theoretically, people can still pledge. But we are then, after a certain time, once we really finalize, I mean, the book is supposed to be sent out very early next year. We're going to lock all the orders, so send out the books to everyone. And once that is done, we are then going to put it on in sort of an in-demand, just buy on Amazon, if Amazon allows us to stock it in their inventory, of course.
And will the books actually be printed and shipped out by Christmas?
Well, no, the delivery time is supposed to be early next year. So,
well.
Yeah. So I mean,
I haven't actually looked up the link yet. So.
if we can do it, we will try to get it done by Christmas. But promise date is early in I'm thinking in World War II times here, 2022. There we go.
Fair enough. Okay, so I'll put the link in the text description below. Last question. I see you got yourself a joystick in the back corner. Do you play any flight sims?
Yes, so I've recently gone back into IL-2, so the Grand Battle series, the new ones, and I'm also trying to to wrestle my way into DCS once again.
Do you play the modern stuff or the World War II stuff?
I actually play the modern stuff with DCS. World War II, that's going to be IL-2 for me, whereas DCS is going to be modern stuff. So I've been trying out the A10 recently and also the Mirage, which is good fun.
I'm enjoying myself in the F5 right now. A nice simple aircraft, and I have to say the helicopter was a hell of a fun. I did the Huey, all the Huey campaigns.
Nice.
Those were amusing. I'm moving to the hip now, and it's kind of like, how many buttons do I have to push to turn this thing on?
Yeah, somebody told me that starting out with the A10 was maybe not the cleverest idea I ever had, and I agree. But that's just seems to be how I do things. But yeah, I know. I was going to go for the F5 as well. So I might give that a spin as well at some point.
Oh, cool. You got the free to try thing. I mean, it's easy. You push 5 buttons, the engine starts. The only problem is that you keep getting shot down without knowing it because you have no useful radar or.
Or it's a lightweight fighter in there, I guess, in a way.
All right. Yeah. Right. Well, good talking to you. Good luck with the book. And I guess I'll talk to you next time I talk to you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And see you later. Bye-bye.